Today, we are especially privileged to have Thandeka return as one of our guests that we've had before, and she's going to engage us in conversation about untrolling America. Today, we welcome this longtime member of our process family to talk about a very current concern. This morning, the Congressional Committee to investigate the January 6th attempt to overthrow the results of the presidential election continues its public hearing as we speak. Meanwhile, we'll learn today what the Reverend Dr. Thandeka has to say about what Trump gets right and Democrats get wrong about white America. After a 16-year career as an Emmy Award-winning television producer, Thandeka entered the Claremont Graduate University and earned a PhD in philosophy of religion and theology. Thandeka has held academic positions, including a visiting scholar at the Center for Process Studies, a fellow at the Stanford Humanities Center, Stanford University, and positions at Harvard, Brandeis, and Andover Newton Theological School. Her dissertation is reflected in her 1995 book, The Embodied Self, Friedrich Schleiermacher's solution to Kant's problem of the empirical self. She's also published Learning to be White, Money, Race, and God in America. That was 2000. And in 2018, she published Love Beyond Belief, Finding the Access Point to Spiritual Awareness. She's conducted many workshops all across the country, particularly on this latter theme. She's president and founder of Love Beyond Belief, a 501c3 education foundation designed to help clergy and laity, activists and educators who use community building processes to deepen connections that heal and to transform the world. Love Beyond Belief offers workshops, courses, consultations, educational resources, and even certificate programs to help people practice the art of compassion through small group spiritual practices that bolster and sustain social justice and eco-justice work. She actually offers a constructive theological and neuroscientific framework for healing and transforming the world, as she explores the links between religion and emotions. Her name, Thandeka, means beloved in Xhosa language. It was given to her by Archbishop Desmond Tutu in 1984. So Thandeka, the beloved one, we're privileged to have you today on a day of emotion-packed congressional hearings, and we're privileged to spend time with you, the founder of contemporary affect theology. We're looking forward to hearing what you have to say about untrolling America, what Trump gets right and Democrats get wrong about white America. But before you talk, we want to give John Cobb a chance to give you an official welcome to his living room. John?
Thandeka knows, I think, how very, very welcome she is. She has long ago begun teaching me and many others about the extreme importance of the emotional dimension of life and how we so often assume that if we can just make sense, that would, at an intellectual level, that would have much effect. And it's very interesting that someone who is so sure of the primacy of the feelings is such an intellectual, very original, creative. I don't know any of my friends from whom I've learned more than from Thandeka. And I'm sure I'm going to learn some more today. Thanks for being here, Thandeka.
Thandeka, it's your turn.
Now I think I will cry for 5 minutes. Truly, thank you, John and Ron and Richard and all of you. It's such a pleasure to be here with you again today. and in truth, to go home, to come home. You can come home again. So let's get going. Donald Trump is the troll in chief of white American politics. His political power, his takeover of the Republican Party, and the growing force and ever-expanding strength of the next generation of Trump Republicans affirm a forbidden truth Trump repeatedly states. White people today represent racism's victims at least as much as Blacks and other minorities. Few Americans understand what his statement means because Trump always trolls the truth. Untrolling America means decoding Trump's troll code, which when accomplished reveals an astonishing fact. Trump is a troll. He trolls the primal survival emotions, anger, fear, and rage. Perhaps this is why he likes being called the troll in chief, the world's greatest troll, and the most superior troll, which he considered a great compliment. He knows who he is and what he does. As New York Times reporter Amanda Hess noted in her February 28, 2017 article, How the Trolls Stole Washington, a troll in the internet world is the bottom feeder of internet culture, not a hero. Trump is a bottom feeder because he appeals to the three of the oldest and most primal emotions of your brain: anger, fear, and rage. We have lots of images of what the word troll refers to. In fishing, when you are trolling, you drop down the weight, extending the fishing line, hoping that fish will jump on the hook. Internet trolls hide behind anonymity because they punch down to attack persons. Fairy tale trolls won't let you cross bridges to explore new terrain. The way I use the term troll focuses your attention on what trolls have in common: anger, rage, and fear. I do so because these are the emotions that get trolled. Trump is a troller because the major source of Trump's power is found in the oldest part of the human brain: anger, rage, and fear. Trump's secret power is found here. He stirs up the raw, innate emotions of anger, fear, and rage in white American voters. His strategy isn't rocket science, it's brain science. He trolls the emotions in their own terms in order to patrol them. He explained his strategy to the New York Times reporter Jeremy Peters, and I quote, "The audience tells me where to go. If it doesn't work and the audience doesn't applaud, I'll never use it again." Donald Trump knows anger, fear, and rage are innate and instinctive feelings. Humans can trigger these feelings, but they cannot create them. They are emotional operating systems of the brain. They are your body's signal system of distress. You do not create these emotions. They create you in their image. They contort your face, furrow your brow, alter your physical movements and gestures, and change the tone and pacing, the feeling tone of your voice to make you express them when they get triggered in your brain. They clue others into what you feel and need in order to survive. Trump trolls these three emotions, but he never explains why the emotions are so easily triggered in millions of white Americans. Instead, he concludes that most whites are victims and suffer at least as much as Black Americans and other minority groups. He's right, because millions of white Americans are a neglected and abused people too. Millions of white Americans are victims of white Americans' abusive systems against them. I will not investigate Trump as a trauma survivor. This work has already been done. Child and adult psychiatrist Steve Rubel makes a strong case in his essay, Trump's Daddy Issues, for explaining Trump's behavior as that of a trauma survivor. Rubel invited his readers to consider the evidence for this basic psychological profile of Trump's mentality. Trump, Rubel argues, seems to have shaped his own identity around a father whose aggressive business and parenting styles created a pervasive field within Trump. As a result, Rubel reasoned, Trump as a child might have learned to absolutely rely on and mime a father who abused him. His, and I quote, psychological wounds still fester, unquote. His puffed up gestures are empty because they hide his fear of seeming weak and ineffectual, like his brother who drank himself to death, Rubel argued. Rubel concluded, Trump's own aggressive behavior as an adult, his, and I quote, lying, distortion, marginalization, and the firing of those who he fears are disloyal, his befuddlement and limited understanding of the impact of his behavior on others, or his insensitivity to it, are characteristics of someone who has scant flexibility to switch gears to handle new challenges, and is likely to change only if reality throws him a large enough curveball to which he is unable to respond using the signature defensive measures he has grown accustomed to. The basic question I seek to answer today is whether Trump won and retained the loyalty of most white voters in America in his two presidential campaigns because he mirrors the neglect and abuse, the emotional history of anger, fear, and rage wrought in them in their own homes and workplace environments, in their own white communities and neighborhoods, even if not in such extreme forms as the abuse and neglect experienced by Trump. I want to know if the myth of infallibility and invulnerability enveloping Trump, as Jeremy Peters has noted in his book Insurgency, mirrors a profound sense of victimization, exclusion, and systemic unfairness most of Trump's white American voters also feel. More precisely, do tens of millions of white American voters depend on Trump because he seems infallible and invulnerable, and thus can protect them because they themselves feel so fallible and invulnerable and vulnerable? Is there indeed a collective trauma mentality in millions of white Americans? And if this emotional mentality is not understood and treated in its own psychological terms, then the social issues linked to their experiences of abuse and neglect cannot be addressed and corrected in their own psychological terms. 60 years ago, the master essayist and novelist James Baldwin tried to explain the state of battered white emotions of anger, fear, and rage without trolling them. In his 1963 bestseller, The Fire Next Time, he told my 1960s generation of African-American baby boomers what we must do. Accept whites with love and patience, because they are still trapped in a history which they do not understand. And until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. Baldwin called upon us not to free white people from their racism, but to help liberate them from their emotional entrapment. To this end, Baldwin called for a new lexicon on race talk in America during his 1986 public address to the National Press Club. We are living in a world in which everybody and everything is interdependent. It is not a white world. It is not black either. And the future of this world depends upon to what extent and by what means we liberate ourselves from a vocabulary which now cannot bear the weight of reality. I can advance this work begun by Baldwin, because I have two things Baldwin lacked: new insights about the nature of trauma and new lab work probing the ancient emotional operating systems of the brain. Baldwin died 6 years before the new diagnostics category for mental disorders called complex post-traumatic stress disorder was created by the Harvard Medical School professor of psychiatry emerita, Judith Lewis Herman. She describes the contours, the general form and structure of this new diagnostic tool for mental disorders in her groundbreaking book, 1992 book, Trauma and Recovery: The Aftermath of Violence from Domestic Abuse to Political Terror. And Baldwin died 12 years before the new field that studies emotions called affective neuroscience was invented by Jaak Panksepp and explained in his 1998 groundbreaking book, Affective Neuroscience: The Foundation of Human and Animal Emotions. It was my good fortune to know Jaak as a friend and to get his help and advice as my consultant for the new field of theology I created called contemporary affect theology. Contemporary affect theology uses insights from his brain work to expand the vistas of affect theology created by the 19th century father of liberal theology, Friedrich Schleiermacher. Jaak and I worked together for 12 years until his death in 2017. Millions of white Americans feel betrayed because they can't achieve the foundational promises made to them by their own government. But few whites can accurately assess the import of their feelings of betrayal because their own original emotional insights keep getting trolled by Trump Republicans and by Democrats, ignored by Democrats. Untrolling America means addressing the suffering, the anger, fear, and rage in order to end the suffering rather than troll the rage. It also means providing safe places to practice this new skill. Troll's etymology takes us to a place stranger than fiction. As we enter this terrain, let's keep two basic points in mind, which affirm the context in which I offer my reflections to the Cobb Institute this morning. First, John Cobb's perspective on emotions. As John has shared with me, Alfred North Whitehead's system can be thought of as a philosophy of emotion. Based on more than half a century of evaluating and using and advancing the work of Whitehead, John concluded that he and Whitehead both affirmed that major events they analyze are constituent processes within human experience and have locus points within the human brain. Moreover, John continued, all of the various types of feelings from both the mental and physical poles of experience are accompanied by an emotional tone, which Whitehead called the subjective forms of the prehensions that are the experiences of the entities in question. Nevertheless, as John put it, there is a chasm between the human brain and conscious human perceptions which must be explored. Thus, the second point I invite you to keep in mind, John's perspective on the chasm between the human brain and conscious human perception in Whitehead's work. I asked John if insights from affect neuroscience, the brain science of emotions, might help fill this gap. In response to this query, John said the use of affective neuroscience is a whole new field that goes a long way to bridge the gap between the objective and the subjective, and to provide the kind of information that can give life to general ideas. I like the idea of using affect to designate the most elemental emotions, since the latter word connotes something that is hard to generalize to purely bodily events. I think affect comes close to what Whitehead means by subjective form. Much more work, John said, is needed to test how well the translation from Whitehead to affective neuroscience will work. But there can be here a genuinely helpful conversation partner, John concluded. My question to John this morning is whether you find it fruitful to talk about trolls and their links to a philosophy of emotions and the brain science of emotions when advancing how process theology becomes a political theology in an age of trolls. As John recently said to me, it seems as if the modern world is committing suicide. And this is the good news, John said, because more and more people now realize their perceptions and the ways they make sense of the world must change. A people without vision will perish. So I look forward to John's reflections. John, after all, became my beloved professor more than 3 decades ago and is now a cherished friend and ongoing conversation partner. Thank you, John, for the invitation to make this presentation to your institute this morning. Let's continue onward. The term troll was invented as a language program 4 centuries ago to express and depict the negative and battered human feelings of anger, fear, and rage, and their immediate social consequences. The Old Norse word troll, which meant giant or demon, usually referred to an ugly dwarf or giant in Scandinavian folklore and children's tales. More precisely, it referred to the antisocial, quarrelsome behavior of slow-witted creatures that made life difficult for kids and travelers. The trolls looked like what they fed on and depicted: anger, fear, and rage. The Troll and the Three Billy Goats Gruff fairy tale, for example, illustrates what fairy tale trolls were originally created to do: depict your feelings when your survival is threatened. The troll lived under a bridge and was dead set on eating anyone who crossed it. The troll thus prevented the bridge from functioning as a bridge to gain access to new places and experiences. Rather, the bridge now functioned as a death watch for the troll's war campaign. 2 billy goats figured out how to gain safe passage by tricking the troll. The third one, the largest of the 3, stood up on his hind legs, knocked the troll over the bridge into the water, and thus the troll got washed away. All the trolls lived happily ever after because they could now eat the grass on both sides of the bridge. This troll story teaches children real things, like how to make sense of why they sometimes feel afraid and get attacked when they try to get what they need in order to survive. It's a warning story, recounted as a silly fantasy tale to make a deadly point. You must be aware of ugly, fearful, loathsome things that make you feel angry, fearful, and enraged because they can destroy your life as you try to do the necessary things needed in order to survive. Consider Morris Sandak's classic children's story about Max, a boy who was not intimidated by trolls, but became their king. The story began simply enough. Max was sent to his room because he told his mother he would eat her up when she called him a wild thing for behaving badly. So she sent him to his room without eating anything at all. Max got mad. He had swallowed enough insults from his mom. His rage and anger now showed up inside him as ghoulish movements drawn by Maurice Sendak, as wild and woolly trolls that roared their terrible roar, gnashed their terrible teeth, and rolled their terrible eyes. Max didn't blink or freak out in their presence. These physical movements of rage and anger were now on full display in Max's fantasy life because his emotions of anger and rage had been trolled, and his mind illustrated and displayed what he felt. But he was not afraid. Instead, he frolicked with the beast and became king of the wild things. These reptilian beasts, these ancient feeling things, these lizard people moved just like his emotions because they were his emotions illustrated. Max returned home because his dinner had been placed on his bedstand by his mom. The emotionally secure and nourished kids like Max don't back down, blink, or freak out. The rest of us blink. Some commit suicide. Others man up saying, "Go ahead, make my day." Your brain, as neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett noted in her elegantly simple book, 7.5 Lessons About the Brain, is not designed as a thinking thing, but as a body management system. Its most important job, Barrett tells us, is to manage our feelings and behavior so we can survive. This innate management system interacts with its environment to make predictions about what our body must do to thrive. It then moves the body's limbs to fend off attacks. It scares away attackers by making us growl, howl, screech, use sticks and stones, or gun down the threat with an Uzi. Trolls, in sum, are ghoulish, imaginary beings that have reptilian grimaces and shapes because they are mental images of their origins, the emotional operating systems of anger, fear, and rage triggered in the oldest part of the brain. Let's do the lab work. 3 of our innate emotions, often called the survival instincts of anger, fear, and rage, are located in the part of your brain called the reptilian brain and the lizard brain because it is the oldest part of the evolutionary chain of the mammalian brain. Its emotions are easily triggered in laboratory animals. All you have to do is turn on a current in the area where, for example, the rage emotional operating system is found. Electrically stimulate this area of the brain, and the animals will rapidly attack, usually biting objects that are in front of them. The attacks become more intense when the current levels are increased. So too with humans. Again, affective neuroscientist Jaak Panksepp. If these same kinds of brain procedures are carried out on humans, people tend to clench their jaws and report feelings of intense anger. But the subjects do not understand why they are angry. They find it hard to provide any rational reasons for their feelings because there's no realistic offensive object in sight. Thanks to this kind of lab work, we can now identify the hidden common ground of partisan politics and culture wars and cancel culture battles. Turn this off, sorry. There. The reptilian emotions of anger, fear, and rage before they get trolled into partisan political narratives. A study by brain scientists turned a group of conflict-prone partisans into lab animals. The scientists scanned the brains of more than 36 politically left and right-leaning adults as they viewed short videos involving hot-button immigration policies, such as the building of the US-Mexican border wall and the granting of protections for undocumented immigrants under the Federal Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. As Yasmin Anwar noted in his October 20, 2020 Media Relations Summary Report. The researchers' finding, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science journal, made two things evident: the shared untrolled feelings and the divisive partisan trolled commentaries. First, the shared untrolled emotions. There was, and I quote, a high shared response across the group in the auditory and visual cortices, regardless of the participants' political attitudes. Their brains were simply triggered. Then their minds provided the drag, the bling, the costuming garb, the troll talk, the narrated differences. Their anger, fear, and rage are innate emotions. Their explanations of what triggered those feelings in them were socially constructed things. In short, trolls. How do I turn this off? There. Second, the mental narratives created by their minds patrol the prior innate triggered feelings into trolls. The language created was troll talk, namely partisan sentiments, politically correct ideas, and chokehold feelings. The concepts sometimes referred to the untrolled raw emotions as instincts and ancient ancestral memories, because they are prefabricated patterns of emotional and physical movements simultaneously linked together. The brain simultaneously triggers those emotions and the physical behaviors such as fight, flight, faint, or freeze at the same time. Both events occur at the same time. You can't have one without the other. This link between triggered emotions and triggered physical movements was created through evolution's trial and error motifs to lock in the best pattern principles and behavior to ensure the organism's survival. Panksepp's laboratory research repeatedly located these instincts in the subcortical regions of the brain, where emotions rather than thoughts are created. Carl Jung, the father of analytical psychology, called this place the psyche. And he called these emotional instincts microbes, pre-existing psychic images and archetypes. These terms for Jung were synonymous with the term instincts. Their instinctual nature, Jung said, are inherited structures with feeling tone complexes. The preeminent historian of religions, Mircea Eliade, studied trolls as ancestral memories. Eliade explored the mythical dimensions of human life in communities and societies, nations and tribes around the world. What gets depicted are human emotions and the physical movements linked to them. The depiction of feelings is why Eliade is what he called myths, exemplary models, paradigms, archetypes of how humans conform their emotions and behavior to these greater than life things in order to have lives that make ultimate sense. The gestures and emotions of the gods and other mystical beings become the paradigmatic gestures and the ritualized emotional displays performed by humans to make their fleeting lives feel real and everlasting. Some of the displays and movements depict, manage, and handle anger, rage, and fear. Mythic beings, trolls, are the brain's innate survival instincts of anger, fear, and rage, costumed in the cultural biases and the narrative garbs of a community. The instincts and the myths created by the trolls are not the same thing, but once they get linked together, separating them can feel like hell because they are now a hell-bent trolling system. The troll talk feels real because it's talk about what you actually feel: anger, fear, and rage. My own work is deeply influenced by the distinction Judith Lewis Herman made between trauma and its fallout, trolls. Judith Lewis Herman, in her 1992 groundbreaking book, Trauma and Recovery, explained her diagnostic tool called complex post-traumatic stress disorder for use as a therapeutic program to treat persons exposed to prolonged experiences of terror. And she listed some of the devastated mentalities by spotlighting the injuries to your inner world. Persons are now prone to self-injury, explosive or extremely inhibited anger, compulsive or extremely inhibited sexuality, and other alterations in defective affect regulation, altered states of consciousness and self-perceptions, alterations in self-perceptions of perpetuators, alienation in relation to others, loss of sustaining faith, and a sense of hopelessness and utter despair. In the 2015 epilogue to her book, Herman listed some of the fallouts that result from extended exposure to terrifying, trauma-inducing events. Racism, climate change, the invasion of Iraq, the rape and ongoing torture of women in their own homes, shell-shocked veterans, child abuse, and the ecological devastation of Mother Earth. I highlight Herman's point. Racism, climate change, genocide, and torture are the fallout. The source of these fallouts is trauma or brain patterns that have the same triggering results. Take Matt Krause. When Texas Republican State Representative Matt Krause emailed a list of 850 dangerous school books to superintendents, he launched a reign of terror campaign against his own white voters' emotions. His campaign was easy to set up because Texas was already afire with fierce battles over education, race, and gender. Krause simply lit another match to ignite more battlefield firepower. Once Krause had inflamed the anxiety and trauma in white voters, he sat back and awaited the results. The next night, at a school board meeting in San Antonio, parents accused librarians of poisoning young minds. The district libraries were accused of housing pornography. Krause had achieved his first goal, firing up his white voters' anger, fear, and rage, and then lowering it by telling voters what they must do now: ban books. Krause had succeeded in positioning himself as a savior and protector of the minds, emotions, and traditional moral and religious values of white kids. By so doing, he garnered future votes for himself from parents who believed he had protected their kids from abuse. By tamping down the hysteria he himself had stirred up in them, the relief they felt made him feel like their savior. Joe Cohn, legislative director for the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, a civil liberties organization, called this kind of misuse of critical race theory in the Texas setting a convenient boogeyman, which is another name for a troll. Trolls feed on anger, rage, and fear. Trump trolls reptilian emotions. So his connection to QAnon narratives is not surprising for two basic reasons. First, QAnon conspiracy theories are actually called reptilian conspiracy theories because that's literally what they are: lizard brain emotions illustrated and narrated as lizard people. According to QAnon conspiracy theory, there's a group of Satan-worshiping, child enslaving, and child trafficking adult Democrats and global elites running government and the media, who are reptilian or lizard people in human form, who drink the blood of children and are trying to take over the world. And the only person with enough power to win the cosmic battle is Donald Trump. Second, these theories are easily explained when you do the lab work. They are called reptilian conspiracies about lizard people because they are stories about the anger and fear and rage triggered in your lizard brain or reptilian brain and then imaged and described as ghoulish things, trolls. So QAnon narratives are mythological narratives. They are not only about the ideological and partisan trolls that make you hate the government, but also about the narrative myth, the make-believe story, namely the blood-drinking cabal of pedophile Democrats and the lizard people who now inhabit the earth in human form. QAnon follower Bucky Wolf, for example, in January 2019, killed his brother in Seattle by stabbing him in the head with a 4-foot-long sword because he was certain that a lizard person had replaced his brother. The recorded 9/11 call he made includes him saying, "Kill me, kill me. I can't live this reality. And God told me he was a lizard." To understand what Wolf thought he saw, you have to understand what he actually felt: terror. He looked at his brother through the terror. So he didn't see his brother, he saw his own terror facing off against him. QAnon conspiracy theories, in sum, are filled with reptilian images because they look like their origins. They are images of the physical movements and facial expressions of the emotions triggered in the oldest part of your brain, namely anger, fear, and rage systems located in your reptilian brain. 17% of Americans, according to an NPR Ipsos poll, believe the core claims of QAnon conspiracy theories are true, namely that an international cabal of Democrats and elites are sex trafficking children and doing other demonic things. Moreover, another 37% of Americans aren't sure whether the allegations are true or completely false. As Maya Bloom and Sophia Moskalenko noted in the opening pages of their book, Pastels and Pedophiles, Inside the Mind of QAnon. 54% of Americans, including people who are young and old, rich or poor, highly educated or high school dropouts, have not completely debunked the QAnon claims. Again, Bluma and Moskalenko, in their book Pastels and Pedophiles, calls these QAnon conspiracy theories weird and specious. These theories are easily explained when you do the lab work. Since QAnon is a reptilian troll, its narratives get linked up with Trump because he wrestles with anger, fear, and rage, which he relentlessly trolls. When the founder and medical director of the Trauma Center in Brookline, Massachusetts, Bessel van Vanderkolk, explains trauma, it's easy to see how trauma can get linked up with trolling. According to Vanderkolk, when something horrific happens to you, it becomes an event that not only overwhelms your central nervous system, but also alters the way you process and recall memories of that event. Your memories of the event are not recollections of things past. Nothing is past, because that's where you now live. According to Thandeka, trauma is not the story of something that happened back then. It's the recurring imprint of that pain, horror, and fear living inside you. Donald Trump became white America's troll in chief because he was the first century political candidate to tell white Americans the truth about the origins of their pervasive feelings of anger, fear, and rage before these feelings get trolled. And then he trolls them. Donald Trump, from day one on his campaign trail, told white Americans a forbidden truth. The American government and the vested interest of big business linked to it are rigged against you. Trump repeatedly told white Americans during his first presidential campaign. Then he offered irrefutable proof himself. I should know, Trump said in countless ways, because I used that rigged system to get rich. Great showman that he is, Trump would then pause and smile broadly as his self-presentation of his evidence continued. Whites hooted and hollered with laughter because everybody knows Trump is only interested in his own advancement. Now I will use my knowledge of this rigged system to dismantle it and protect you, Trump crescendoed. The crowds believed him, went euphoric, and this energy helped get him elected as America's 45th president. The proof of his success can't be tallied by the number of times Trump stoked the anger and rage and fear in white American voters. The New York Times reporters Patrick Healy and Maggie Haberman, in their December 5th, 2015 article, did the numbers. They counted the 95,000 words found in Trump's early campaign rallies and concluded the specter of violence looms over much of his speech, which is infused with words like kill, destroy, and fight. The target of his speech wasn't white people as a race or class of people, but rather as a neglected, abused, and traumatized people. The British newspaper The Guardian spotlighted the result, namely the major factor that contributed to Trump's election victory. It published the results of its exit polls in the November 9, 2016 article, White and Wealthy Voters Gave Victory to Donald Trump, Exit Polls Show. What appeared to have made the biggest difference on election night was the turnout for Trump of white voters across the board, of both sexes, almost all ages and education levels, and from mid and higher income levels. Trump won the vast majority of white American voters in the 2016 presidential election. The political scientist Robert Papp spotlighted the January 6, 2021 results, which we can translate into two terms, trolled and untrolled emotions. Papp discovered the connection between major labor and identity issues motivating the 380 or so arrested in connection with the attack. More precisely, Papp found the historic formula used in America's marketplace economy that links white labor to non-white labor. Papp found that the greater the increase in the non-white population in the hometown, the greater the chance that a blue-collar white worker would storm the Capitol. Typically, these rioters had no ties to existing white right-wing groups. Typically, these rioters had no ties to existing right-wing groups. Papp found that 95% of the persons arrested were white, 85% were male, 52% came from blue-collar counties that Biden comfortably won. Counties that had the greatest decline in white population had an 18% chance of sending an insurrectionist to Washington, while counties that had the least decline in the white population had only a 3% chance. These white men knew their wages would tank as non-whites entered the labor market. White business owners almost always search for cheaper non-white labor. Accordingly, these exploited and vulnerable white wage earners voted with their feet. Their rage united outright white supremacists and rabid racists with whites who were simply afraid that their income and standard of living would continue to tank and would not be able to survive. Papp thus arrived at two rules of thumb. Robert Papp's first rule of thumb: track down the job loss issues in the rioters' own labor-related terms. Counties with the most significant declines in non-Hispanic white population are the most likely to produce insurrectionists who now face charges. And his conclusion: ignore this movement at your own peril because it won't blow away. The ingredients exist for future waves of political violence, for lone wolf attacks, to all-out assaults on democracy surrounding the 2022 midterm elections. The labor issue I am spotlighting here is the declining economic value of most white wage earners. Papp's second point: track down the abandonment issues of the rioters in their own non-racial emotional terms. These whites felt their identities and cultures were now at risk. The Washington Post reporter Eugene Scott interviewed Papp and reported the results in his April 12, 2021 article. Data about the Capitol rioters serve another blow to the white working class Trump supporter narrative. Papp, so we learn, discovered that class talk wasn't enough to explain the rage. Nearly half, 48% of white working class Americans said, things have changed so much that I often feel like a stranger in my own country. Whites feared America was losing its cultural heritage, traditions, and identity. Trump knows that most whites who aren't wealthy in America get trashed, jailed, medically maltreated, outcast, exiled, and wasted, just like Black Americans. Consider the stats. The United States is consistently ranked as having one of the worst child poverty rates among the 37 countries of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. Although the poverty rate is vastly higher among Black Americans, numerically, there are more white kids living in poverty in America than Black kids. When the only persons tallied in our nation's massive incarceration system are white, the United States still has more persons in prison than any other country in the world except for Russia and China. 1.2 million people attempt suicide in the US each year. Of these, around 46,000 people die, and 70% of those people are white males. Compared to peer nations, the US has among the highest rate of hospitalization from preventable causes and the highest rate of avoidable deaths. Millions of whites, as these stats indicate, are exposed to the same economic and social systems that hurt Black Americans. But most whites and Blacks don't know it because the white complaints are expressed as personal betrayal, while the Black complaints are expressed as racial grievances. Black explains the assaults in racial terms as white supremacy. Whites do not explain their assaults in wealth supremacy terms. Rather, they see themselves as the great novelist John Steinbeck described so aptly. The poor whites see themselves not as exploited proletariat, but as temporarily embarrassed millionaires. Most of the rioting whites on January 6th felt they were getting a raw deal from the government and big business, and they're right. Their protest, however, was not expressed as a class issue or a race issue by most of the rioters, except for the white nationalist extremists. But rather, the protesters fielded as an emotional one, namely as a pervasive feeling of betrayal born of anger, fear, and rage. Add to this pervasive sense of voter betrayal Trump's claim of election fraud, and the power cake exploded. Trump's supporters simply got the date and setting of the big steal wrong. The real raw deal actually took place in Philly in 1787. The US Constitution was not designed as a one-man, one-vote system of governance. The present day attempts to prevent voters from voting, to disenfranchise them, to render their vote politically meaningless, and have precedents. The US Constitution, one of the foundational texts for the disenfranchisement of most white voters in America, was created by the US Constitution when the US Constitution race-gained its own political system. More precisely, the framers diminished the voting power of non-slave holding white voters and made it look like an attack against Blacks. The 3/5 clause, compromise. There are two major racial crime sites in white America, but one of them keeps getting ignored by most Democrats and Republicans, but not by Donald Trump, who trolls the grave sites of white Americans' dread. Jazz singer Billie Holiday in the late 1930s described what you see when standing at the public site: strange fruit hanging from southern trees, blood at the root, Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze. The assailants aren't found there, just their acts. What appears today as the condemned feelings and the forbidden knowledge, which appears today as the condemned feelings and forbidden knowledge that gets gagged by chokeholds, suffocated by knees on the neck, shot while sleeping or jogging, and incarcerated at the crime scene of an unspeakable truth. Strangled white feelings do not go away, but take cover in somebody else's body. Those bodies in white America are Black. This first racial crime scene can be called the outside job because it's an actual physical location in time and space, usually cordoned off by the police with yellow tape. Coroners, cops, detectives, family and friends, and gawkers are found there. The second racial crime scene can be called the inside job because it's a private site located inside whites. It's the place where stifled emotions get dumped, devastated feelings get patrolled, and their remains carted off to hell. Black bodies are piled on top of the site as distraction narratives. backward-gazing protocols and damning charges to keep the actual content of the second sight from view. Found in the second sight are the bodies of whites filled with anguished feelings of betrayal. The names on the tombstones of the bodies interred in this second sight are taken from places with major wage issues like Grand Junction, Colorado. Grand Junction, Colorado, thanks to the collapse of the local energy industry, suffered an 11% loss of the workforce between 2009 and 2014. Social collapse followed. There was a 65% increase in felony filings. Grand Junction had the highest homicide rate in the state. There was an epidemic of drug addiction, and its suicide rate was nearly 2.5 times that of the nation. As one of the Trump voters told New York reporter Peter Hessler, who tracked these stats in his July 24, 2017 letter from Colorado, and she said, "I think America is lost to us." Another Trump voter put it this way: "What liberals and elites hate about him is what they hate about us." Trump's preening and prances and his refusal to acknowledge defeat feel to these whites like their bodies resurrected, adorned, and seated next to the man anointed by God to save America. These white Americans cast a dark shadow on modern American society, as Benedict Carey put it in his June 9, 2018 New York Times article. Slowly, confoundingly, suicide became a public health crisis. Neither working nor looking for work, these whites are the discounted part of what was celebrated as America's healthy labor market, with its unemployment rate around 4%. Democrats often focus on racism or white mob passions when explaining Trump's rise to power. Trump keeps trumping the anguish and rage of white betrayal, and he becomes the cosmic force in QAnon conspiracy theories ever anew because he wrestles with reptilian forces, namely the cosmic forces of anger, fear, and rage in the human brain that are older than the human species. Is it any wonder that most voters chose a self-confessed crook who delighted their hearts and pumped their rage to lead them? Trump's not lying to them about who he is, a crook. He agrees with his followers that he was forced to break some rules in order to get where he is. They want to break the rules too. Robin DiAngelo, in her best-selling 2018 book, White Fragility, Why It's So Hard to Be White for White People to Talk About Racism, almost got it right when talking about the emotional life of whites. She just didn't take her analysis far enough. Instead, DiAngelo equated the turbulent emotions triggered in whites by race narratives with the hidden content of these feelings that had little, if anything, to do with race or whiteness in America. A joke helps to spotlight the emotional content DiAngelo's analysis overlooked. It's an exaggerated story to highlight a consistently overlooked point. White fragility isn't a race thing in most whites, it's a trolled thing. Namely, the way human emotions get triggered and exploited, whitewashed and blackfaced to hide their origins, the pain and suffering felt by millions of white Americans in their own homes and communities. Think about what happened after President Abraham Lincoln, while attending a performance of the comedy Our American Cousin at Ford Theater, was shot by John Wilkes Booth in the back of the head. A theater buff at, at the performance said to Mrs. Lincoln as she was escorted from the theater, weeping, wailing, and flailing her arms about because of the gut-wrenching pain wrought in her by the attack on her husband. Other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you like the play? This oft-recounted joke is funny because the enormity of Mrs. Lincoln's shock and horror, her agony and pain, and the pervasiveness of her feelings of loss and grief and sorrow got displaced by the interest and thoughts, concepts, and ideas of a singularly focused, severely emotionally constricted theater buff. Rather than take into account Mrs. Lincoln's own feelings and experiences, he summarily set them aside. Rather than see the play from the perspective of Mrs. Lincoln's vision that got destroyed by the blood and gore of her husband's critical injuries, the man's own singular interest dismissed her distress. This joke serves as a micro-morality story, a warning narrative about what happens when you ignore the raw, triggered feelings of others. You might inadvertently assault their sensibilities and devastated feelings anew. Similarly, the anguished feelings in whites prompted by their own personal experiences of harm within their own white communities and families can get commandeered and then displaced by race talk. As a consequence, their flailing can get misread as white fragility about race issues and white privileges. Or as the poet Stevie Smith might put it, these whites are mistakenly seen as waving, but they're actually drowning. They aren't thumbing their nose, they're holding their nose as they go down. I am hypothesizing that more often than not, white trauma and neglect, which have nothing to do with Black Americans, get trolled into race talk and then have everything to do with us. Quite unexpectedly, I had a chance to test my theory several years ago at a teen retreat. I was the keynote speaker at a weekend retreat for teens raised in one of the wealthiest, whitest, most highly educated, and smallest religious associations in America, Unitarian Universalism. The Unitarian roots of this liberal Protestant religious tradition include Benjamin Franklin, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Henry David Thoreau. The adult conference planners of the teen retreat wanted me, I am one of only a handful of ordained Black ministers in this liberal religious association, to talk about my book, Learning to Be White. I should be hard on the kids, I was told. Make them feel bad about their white skin privileges because they're racist and must repent. Almost all of the teens on the retreat were white kids who went to middle-class schools and lived in middle-class families in middle-class white enclaves. They were destined to lead college-educated middle-class professional lives. But I'd never met a group of middle-class American kids who collectively didn't feel afflicted in some granular way. I had no desire to afflict the afflicted. So there I was with these millennials who had been weaned on social rebellion by their baby boomer parents, schooled in anti-racism work at church, and were residents in a cyber world that seemed to relic me and the portable Olivetti typewriter I took to college. The setting for my presentation was a high school gym. 50 or so teens were present when I arrived. They roamed around like exhausted sheep, unable to fight or take flight. When I climbed up the 5 stairs to the small platform that served as the staging area for my presentation, the teens immediately went silent and their bodies froze to brace for their imminent slaughter. I was taken aback. You probably already know what I'm going to say to you, I began. The teens sheepishly made bleeping-like sounds of laughter. I immediately requested a volunteer, namely someone who would join me on stage, pretend to be me, and deliver the speech on race and white racism the teens expected me to present. One of the boys, who looked like the blonde-haired wily Eddie Haskell character on the Leave It to Beaver late 1950s TV show, immediately raised his hand, took center stage as the invited guest speaker, and delivered my expected speech. He explained why prejudice is bad and white racism is wrong. There is really only one race, the human race, he concluded. So everybody should cross the racial divides and become one loving family. The teens laughed and loved the unexpected show in which one of their own had been cast as the central player and star. They applauded him before he began, cheered him on throughout his speech, and gave him a standing ovation at the end. The teen bowed several times, raised his arms and made the victory sign with his fingers, and then started to leave the stage. I reached out and asked him to remain on stage and field questions from his audience. He walked to the middle of the stage again, and with body language saying, "Bring it on and show me what you got," he responded to the queries, again spouting the moral platitudes he had learned from his teachers and parents. One of the teenage girls finally summarized the rising collective discomfort in the gathering, saying, "Tell us something real. Tell us something that will make a difference in our lives right now." The speaker went silent. The time for gaming the system had just ended. I thanked the teen speaker. We applauded him again for his courage and aplomb. And then I said to the teens, let's talk about things that will make a difference in your life right now. Your feelings. I told them harsh stories from my own perfect middle class life as a teen. I talked about experiences that made me feel lost, alone, and afraid as a teen in the midst of my own highly educated, liberal, and professionally successful parental environment. These weren't stories about race. These were stories about feeling defaced, betrayed, and ignored within my own Pleasantville family life. I then left the stage and sat on the floor in the midst of the teens. They immediately formed a large circle in which I was now simply one of the points of its circumference. And then we waited. One by one, the teens stood and talked about their feelings. They disclosed stories of abuse, of betrayal, of being the unwanted child, stories about not feeling loved, appreciated, or adored by the people who were supposed to love them. Some of the teens cried as they spoke. The teens held and comforted one another. And at the end of each story, we said together, "We hear you and we hold you in our hearts." Most of the teens on the retreat recounted experiences of harm and abuse in their own homes, schools, and white communities. If I had followed the conference planner's advice and lectured the teens on white skin privilege and white racism, their non-racial personal feelings of panic, rage, abuse, and betrayal would have gotten black-faced or whitewashed and then trolled into interracial narrative conflict narratives about why whites and blacks just should get along better but can't. Their true feelings would have been trolled into false racial narratives. Instead, I had inadvertently conducted a micro version of the 1985 study of adverse childhood experiences recounted by 50,000 predominantly middle-class, middle-aged, well-educated, generally financially solvent white Americans who were patients of San Diego's Kaiser Permanente Department of Preventative Medicine. White middle-class homes are often emotion disaster zones for their kids. White middle-class homes are often emotion disaster zones for their kids. In 2002, Dr. Robert Anda, a Centers for Disease Control and Prevention official, wept as he presented the findings at a public forum on child abuse. Trauma specialist Bessel van der Kolk summarized the proceedings of this public forum. He said, Dr. Anda had stumbled upon the greatest and most costly public issue in the United States, child abuse. Dr. Andel estimated the toll. Its overall costs exceed those of cancer or heart disease. He also tallied what would happen if American child abuse ended. The overall rate of depression would be reduced by more than half, alcoholism by 2/3, and suicide, illicit drug use, and domestic violence by 3/4. It would also have a dramatic effect on workplace performance and vastly decrease the need for incarceration. Then came the personal confession as part of a second summary of the Kaiser report. Dr. Sandra L. Bloom summarized the Kaiser report's results during her 2011 John Bowlby Memorial Lecture, Creating, Destroying, and Restoring Sanctuary. The higher the score of adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, Dr. Bloom noted, the more likely was the person to suffer from one of the following: smoking, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, hepatitis, heart disease, fractures, diabetes, obesity, alcoholism, intravenous drug use, depression, and attempted suicide, teen pregnancy, sexually transmitted diseases, poor occupational health, and poor job performance. Worse yet, she continued, the higher the ACE score, the more likely people were to have a number of these conditions interacting with each other. In other words, the higher the ACE score, the greater the impact on a person's physical, emotional, and social health. She too had been raised by parents who deemed emotions a weakness. Her conclusion was thus logical, sound, and also personal. If you have not experienced empathy from your caregivers, it is more difficult to respond to others with empathy. What comes more naturally is to react to the other person without thinking and without awareness of their feelings. Dr. Bloom also updated the Kaiser finding reports. A 2009 U.S. Department of Justice report found that most U.S. children are exposed to violence in their daily life. Over 60% had been exposed to violence in the last year, and nearly half had been assaulted. The birthplace of anxiety in many middle-class white American, the birthplace of anxiety in many middle-class white American kids was exposed. Their homes, their homes, their homes. Empathy gets gutted, compassion is damned, caring eviscerated. The only protection most whites have against these abusive environments is their whiteness, which was fabricated to protect white from the harshest, earliest forms of unfettered greed in America. genocide against first Americans, and chattel slavery against Africans and segregation against their progeny. This white protection shield, however, also keeps the source of distress in millions of white Americans concealed, unfettered greed linked to the vested interests of America's political system. Americans who massacre children and adults, gun down former partners and co-workers, push people in front of moving trains, turn road rage into road kills, and murder people they are paid to serve and protect, aren't born bad, they're driven mad by the neglect, indifference, and abuse meted out to them by their own shattered families. The source of this abusive system is hidden by rage, and the rage expressed in its most pervasive adult form today is political extremism and violent white supremacist movements, which, if not transformed, will topple the efforts to shore up America's democracy. But are millions of white Americans really the frayed and ravaged victims of attacks against them by their own kith and kin, their own teachers, bosses, politicians, and other whites upon whom they must depend in order to survive? I had to take one more emotion into account to answer this question: greed. Greed is the emotional structure of America's wealth supremacist big business governance system. Greed functions in your brain like a cocaine hit. Both greed and blow, a street name for cocaine, have the same brain stimulus and reward circuitry protocol. In both cases, dopamine is released in the brain, as Andrew W. Lowe, when director of MIT's Laboratory for Financial Engineering, noted in his October 12, 2011 essay, Fear, Greed, and Financial Crises, a cognitive neuroscience perspective. Greed is a highly enjoyable trip as a dopamine hit, until, of course, the crash. The threat of financial loss, as neurobiologist Darsha Narvez noted, activates the same fight or flight response as a physical attack, releasing adrenaline and cortisol into the bloodstream, resulting in elevated heart rate, blood pressure, and alertness. Again, Dr. Narvez. The presence or thought of money can shift focus to yourself, energizing your self-interest and decreasing empathy. Situations such as competition can also promote the ethics of protectionism. American slavery was a product of greed. So too are drug companies, .com businesses, insurance companies, investment banks, and equity firms that traffic in human pain for unfettered greed. Healthcare systems today search ever anew for ways to jack up profits by slashing wages and gutting employee benefits, destroying or absorbing other businesses, and increasing the price of life-sustaining products just to make more money. These enterprises and business strategies are not simply born of conspiracies to gorge the wages of the working poor, nor are they the fallout from conservative, moderate, or liberal political policies. They are created by mentalities that act financially like relentless money-making machines because that's what they have become. This mental disorder, unfettered greed, is an addictive system with blowback. It's a survival instinct on crack. And each major crash devastates millions of lives. The stock market crash of 1929, the Black Monday crash of 1987, the stock market scam of 1982, the dot-com bubble burst of 2000, and the stock market and housing crash of 2008, and most recently, the Bitcoin crash. A remarkably simple example of the destructive power of unfettered greed as a self-destructive emotional disorder makes the point. The Camorra Mafia illegally buried 10 billion tons of toxic garbage in their own region near Naples for billions of dollars in profits. When one of the mobsters involved in the dumping operation thought about the carcinogenic effects of the toxic garbage on himself, his family, his community, and their future, he complained to his Camorra boss, saying, "We're polluting our own house, our own land. What are we going to drink?" "You idiot," the voice replied. "We'll drink mineral water." The dumping continued, and the complaining mobster became the compliant thug. Refusal was not an option. His life and the well-being of his wife and family would have been at risk now rather than in the future. So he drank the Kool-Aid, namely the mineral water, as he poisoned the well streams of his own life. The greed factor in American big business and government gets trolled out of sight in white America. Unfettered greed targets whites as well as Blacks and other minorities in America. All of them get sold down the river. The price difference, but not the intent. Enormous financial profits. An untrolling era in America began after the murder of George Floyd by a white Minneapolis police officer. The emotional responses by millions of white Americans to the 9-minute and 29-second YouTube video on the May 25, 2020 murder prompted millions of white Americans to join the Black Lives Matter protest marches and rallies. The Reverend Al Sharpton heralds this burgeoning era and movement during his July 9, 2020 eulogy for George Floyd. God took the rejected stone and made him the cornerstone of a movement that's going to change the whole wide world. The movement didn't change the world, but the emotions white Americans felt by their own testimony did change them. Many white Americans felt like Tanya Holtz-Zappel, 56. She said she felt energized. Marching made her feel like she was channeling that energy. "I'm not just sitting at home," she said. "My outrage for Trump is so strong." Or they felt like Stephen, 29, who is white and from Chattanooga, Tennessee. Stephen said that as he protested, his chest was tight and his eyes were burning with tears. "Honestly, I've never really experienced anything like that," he said. "I didn't expect just like that surge of energy and emotion, adrenaline and anger." Gina, who is white and from Sunnyvale, California, put it this way: "It was surreal. It was emotional for me to hear stories of others, to have my children participate in something that is a moment in history, to teach them what it means to have a voice and to hear others who haven't been heard for so long." Tim, 27, who is white and from Seattle, said, "It felt like really we were directly backing policy change, which felt cool to me." An analysis of these kinds of feelings describes why white protesters should keep two things in mind. First, the age and education demographics. The people who participated in the rallies were mostly white, were mostly well-educated and young. More than 3/4 of those surveyed were under the age of 34, and 82% of the white protesters had a college degree, while 67% of the Black protesters had a college degree. Second, their religion demographics. A significant portion of the white participants were probably nuns, namely persons who identify as either atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. Nuns are people who are either mostly or entirely disaffiliated religiously. Moreover, Generation Z, that is persons born mid-90s to 2010, is the least religious. Those persons are the least religious and most activist generation in American history. Furthermore, as America's churches and other religious organizations tank in non-Trump America, America's interest in spirituality keeps soaring. The secular and religious prayer life of the American people thus has a pluralistic edginess, because 90% of Americans still say they believe in God or a higher power. And almost a third of atheists, 31%, say they experience spiritual peace and well-being. And roughly 1 in 5 self-described atheists, 18%, say they do believe in some kind of higher power. Yet less than half of the American populace regularly attend services at a church, a synagogue, mosque, or other religious institution. This ecumenical pluralism in American spirituality and religious expressions means that when atheists and humanists talk about their personal spiritual experiences of the uplifting of the human spirit, for example, they have full license to do so without referring to a God, says Greg Epstein, noted in his bestseller, Good Without God, What a Billion Non-Religious People Do Believe, or when they affirm their prayer life as the equivalent of a highly versatile, always reliable, perfectly legal, free, non-physically addictive or intoxicating drug, Epstein wrote, they are talking about their personal experiences by redefining the term prayer in non-religious ways. They thus maintain the difference between what they feel, spiritual uplift, and what they think by not making religious claims. Add to these stats the fact that Americans pray more than any other, more often and more likely to attend weekly religious services and ascribe higher importance to faith in their lives than adults in most wealthy Western democracies, such as Canada, Australia, and most European states. And it's reasonable to conclude that countless white protesters might have felt that they were walking their non-religious spiritual talk. They were used to thinking about their ideas, about cultural narratives, and other partisan things, but they might not have known how to talk about their new unbounded energy and feelings as their spiritual connections to one and all, namely as their unbounded feelings of universal connections. The results of these shifts in white Americans' emotional landscape produced something quite consequential, perhaps for countless white protesters. They had soaring feelings, but most didn't have a clue about what to do with these feelings or what they should do next. So they looked to the Black leaders for advice and guidance. Black Lives Matter organizers, recognizing their own organizational problems, went in search of new advisors. They turned to the trusted elder stalwarts like Bernard Lafayette, 79, who accompanied Martin Luther King Jr. on the 1968 trip to Memphis, where he was assassinated. He has spent recent years training young activists in nonviolent social change, and now fields 15 to 20 phone calls a day from young protest organizers. You need training, Lafayette said. You need to build coalitions. And you need one more thing, music, he insisted. Once you get those artists singing songs about change and the movement, that helps to stimulate people and bring them together. There is nothing like music to bring people together. Why music? Music dances feelings. It lifts up bodies, swings them around, raises and lowering them like a wave, a movement, a jam session, a line dance. But little was done to orchestrate those feelings into a free-ranging symphony of harmony, a jazz band of dissonance and riffs, or a hip-hop accord. Political pitches in this movement of untrolled feelings sounded off key. When New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, for example, addressed demonstrators after police reforms were passed in Albany, he could congratulate them because of what he had overlooked when saying, "You don't need to protest. You won. You accomplished your goal." His message to them was thus, "Go home. Your work is done." Dozens of new demonstrators inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement stuck around. But the newly freed and energized feelings white protesters felt and described weren't tracked. The polling didn't measure those feelings of unity, uplift, empowerment, and agency. The UMass Lowell Center for Public Opinion National Polls September 2020 report, for example, documented the vastly different sets of ideas between Black and white assessments of American law enforcement protocol. 73% of Black Americans still believed Blacks are treated less fairly by the police than whites, compared to 48% of white Americans. The feelings that brought millions of white Americans into the marches in unity with Black Americans weren't tracked and tabulated. Instead, the difference between Black and white American ideas were measured and found to be unchanged. What had changed were the feelings that millions of white Americans celebrated and experienced together. And these feelings await new terms and strategies to explain them, and posters to tally them. Liberal politicians and clergy haven't provided what's now needed for tens of millions of Americans, an interreligious and interspiritual but not religious initiative and movement for untrolling America's feelings and healing them through care and compassion. Small groups that function as micro-communities are a good place to begin. Cultural anthropologist Margaret Mead, after all, was right when she said, "A small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." She just got the number wrong. Millions of such groups are required to unveil America's non-partisan feelings and attend to them in emotionally transformative ways. Small groups are necessary because human emotions are not a solo act. Small groups are necessary because human emotions are not a solo act. For more than a decade, I have led workshops in which I simply ask the participants in small group settings, virtual or real, to recall a peak exhilarating personal experience and then describe the experience to other members of the group. I do not invite them to explain why they felt that way, but rather to simply describe where they were and what they felt. These kinds of feelings, when shared and strengthened through small group experiences, become the universal connections realized, the small groups working together that untroll America. The generating power of these groups isn't rage or fear or anger. It's freedom from the entrapments of trolled lives. In this time of heightened loneliness, We need new ways to gather together in small groups of up to 8 persons who meet together on a regular basis. In these small groups that meet weekly or bi-weekly or monthly, each member shares and also listens to the details, textures, content, and feelings and ideas of others' personal experiences. People practice deep listening and pay attention to the details of their own lives and each other's lives in these gathered communities. I saw firsthand why so many Americans need such groups in January 2020, when I attended the Sunday service, worship service of a white mainline liberal church of middle-class, highly educated congregants. The community was polite, well-mannered, laid back, and well-heeled. For several months, I had been consulting with the church regarding the formation of small groups. So I had a strong sense of that I understood the minister and laity until something quite uncharacteristic happened during the guest performance of a white jazz singer and his white jazz band during the January service. Congregants rose to their feet, clapping, hooting, and shouting as the jazz singer's stellar performance crescendo. Feelings broke out of their gated confinements as he repeatedly crooned the refrain. Everybody gets noticed now and then, unless, of course, that person, it should be invisible, inconsequential me. Mr. Cellophane should have been my name, Mr. Cellophane, because you can look right through me, walk right by me, and never know I'm there. The music combined with the words made me wonder if a great many middle-class, well-heeled white Americans might also feel effaced and their bodies rendered invisible as anything other than a suit. Astonished by what I had overlooked, but now clearly saw, namely the hidden, disrupted emotions, the untrolled feelings, now protesting their confinement and celebrating their momentary freedom. The display by so many of the congregants made me think about another invisible man. The nameless Black protagonist in Ralph Ellison's mid-20th century classic, The Invisible Man. In the novel's opening paragraph, he explains he has been spooked. Here's what he says. I am an invisible man. No, I am not a spook like those who haunted Edgar Allan Poe, nor am I one of your Hollywood ectoplasms. I am a man of substance, of flesh and blood, of fiber and liquids, and I might even be said to possess a mind. I am invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. The anguish of Mr. Cellophane and the invisible man converged while also retaining their distinction. Their hidden feelings were exposed, revealing their sorrow, loss, and grief. Their feelings merged with my own anguished feelings, and I wept. Perhaps the formation of small groups, networked together, millions strong, can create America's new second coming era in which anger, fear, and rage are transformed into compassionate community work that heals and transforms us all. And we, like a phoenix rising, can soar to the sky-high dreams of American democracy, finally realized, affirmed, and fulfilled. So I want to offer you an invitation to participate in one of the Universal Connections workshops. Thank you.